Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be concluding our series comparing Battlefield 6 vehicles with their counterparts in the game of War Thunder with the aircraft. And of course, like every section before this, our first task is going to be figuring out exactly what these two helicopters are supposed to be based on. Now, the M77E Falchion, wherever the hell they got that name from, is obviously a variant of the Apache. I'm guessing an E model, although it could also be a D model. I'm not entirely certain on that. The Panthera KHT is actually a little bit more interesting. Obviously, this bears a lot of resemblance, at least in terms of name-wise, to the Tiger UHT, the German attack helicopter. The main German attack helicopter is currently called the Tiger UHT, but was previously called the KHT. However, there is a small issue because the Tiger UHT, KHT, whichever you want to call it, didn't actually have the 30mm cannon. While some variants like the Hod and Hop do have the 30mm cannon, as far as I can tell, no version that has the 30mm cannon also has the mass-mounted sensor, with which this version is depicted as having. So it's certainly possible there is a variant out there that I'm simply missing, or that this combination of features was tested, but the Panthera KHT is not actually a Tiger UHT despite the name similarities. In reality and in game, of course, this is going to function a lot closer to something like a Tiger Hod or a Hop because the mass-mounted sensor doesn't really do anything in game. The attack helicopters tend to be the best armed and armored aircraft, although that's really not saying much. They can't take more than one Stinger reliably without taking fatal damage, and often a single RPG hit or a single missile hit of any kind will be enough to destroy them. On the whole, they can't really take that much damage, but they are at least more resistant to small arms than some of the other helicopters. They do feature a two-man crew. The pilot has access to two of the weapon stations, and the gunner controls the main gun and also another hard point. And this is a rather unusual instance because this is the only instance of any of the vehicles we've talked about so far where the main gun is actually controlled by your gunner and not your pilot. Speaking of, now is probably a good time to mention that in-game both of these helicopters feature a radar. That radar seems to be about as useful as it is on the anti-air, that is to say, not at all. However, while the Apache D and E models both have radars, as far as I can tell, no variant of the Tiger currently has a search radar on it. So there is a bit of a hand-waving, or maybe the game is just assuming the mass-mounted sensor that's basically just an infrared and laser targeting pod is also a radar. Whatever the case is, the game is hand-waving the Eurocopter Tigers as having radars when most of the variants that this would theoretically be representing currently do not. Additionally, up to this point, the main guns that we've had on various vehicles have actually been pretty similar. In terms of the main battle tank, you had the L44 and the L55 Rheinmetall, so a difference in muzzle velocity, but you could kind of hand-wave that in game. Additionally, when you look at the IFVs, both of them were essentially using Bushmaster cannons. One was using a 25, one was using a 30, but in practice and in game, they would actually function very similarly to the point where you could hand-wave that, and obviously both of the anti-airs were using the 35mm Oerlikons. In this case, however, the guns mounted on these two helicopters are actually somewhat different. The Guyot 30mm is higher velocity and higher rate of fire, and also has much more variable types of ammo it can fire, whereas the Apache's gun has a dual-purpose heat-high explosive round that it mains and doesn't really use any other type of ammunition, also generally a little lower velocity and also lower rate of fire. In-game, both of these guns function essentially exactly the same with no differences that I could really tell. Now, one of the more interesting aspects is looking at the various rockets and missiles that are available to these helicopters. The first one is the aim-guided rockets, which as far as I can tell are representing the laser-guided Hydra rockets, which are a variant that was developed by the US military as basically a cheaper alternative to a Hellfire if you wanted a precision-guided weapon. As a bit of a side note, not really related to this particular video, I did have the chance to talk to an Apache pilot, and he said his unit didn't particularly care for these because the rockets tended to impact at such a shallow angle that they didn't always fuse correctly, but that's just one person's tale, but I thought it was interesting regardless. The light rockets are obviously supposed to be something closer to a SNEB or an FFAR rocket, something that could be fired in larger volumes, may not individually be that powerful. As far as I can tell, I know the Apaches are rated for the laser-guided Hydras, and the Apaches are obviously rated for normal Hydras. The Tigers are rated for the SNEB rockets, and I believe some are also rated for the Hydras. I think some of the Tigers are rated for the laser-guided Hydras, but I'm not 100% on that. The last one is the heavy rocket, rockets, and these are closer to something like a Zuni rocket in terms of firepower, and as far as I'm aware, neither of these helicopters are rated for something in that size range. Obviously, it's a dumb rocket, so it wouldn't take that much work to jury-rig it. As we've seen in the Russo-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainians have jury-rigged Zuni rockets to basically Mi-24 Hinds and Su-25, so it's certainly not impossible or even that difficult, but as far as I'm aware, I've never really seen either of these helicopters use this type of weapon. As far as missiles, the first option you get is an air-to-air missile, essentially a Stinger, or in the case of a lot of the Tigers, it would be a Mistral, but they function very similarly to the point where you wouldn't really notice that much of a difference if they were both simplified down to Battlefield 6, so having them both basically be the same thing isn't that big of a deal. The aim-guided missiles are where this gets a little weird because these are ostensibly supposed to be representing essentially tow missiles. However, as far as I can tell, neither of these aircraft are rated for tows. The Tigers are generally rated for missiles like the Hot Missile, which are at least close enough, but I've never seen or heard of an Apache using tow missiles. Obviously, they could be rated for it. It is in the US inventory, but as far as I'm aware, this isn't really a thing, or at least it's so infrequently done that it would be somewhat odd to see an Apache running around with these. The last weapon system, and this is locked to the gunner station, is actually the Lock guided missiles, which the game lists as Hellfires, although I will contest that they are not actually Hellfires. Certainly the Longbow Hellfire is a fire and forget missile, but it's actually a radar guided missile, so you couldn't use it on something like a Tiger that doesn't have a radar to give it some form of initial guidance. This is more likely something like the PARS missiles or a JAGM, which both of these helicopters are at least rated for something that can kind of sort of do what these missiles do. The heavy rockets and the aim-guided missiles on the Apache are the only two that I couldn't really find an equivalent weapon system that these helicopters are specifically rated for. You do have two equipment options you can select on the attack helicopters, either emergency repair, which can fix you if you're heavily damaged, or target detection, which can find enemies that are nearby. On top of that, you also get your pick of upgrades. You have the radar system, which as we discussed is a little questionable on the Tiger. You also have heavy warheads, which increases the firepower of your weapon systems. You have interference, which increases the amount of time it takes enemies to lock you, and you also have the improved armor, which increases your durability at the cost of your agility. As far as my overall thoughts on the attack helicopters, the loadout you use is probably going to come down to your own personal preference. Personally, I am kind of hopeless with the aim-guided anti-tank missiles. At least trying to aim them successfully from a helicopter is a bit difficult for me personally, so I actually use the lock-on air-to-air missiles. They are pretty useful if somebody's already burned their flares, and I find a lot of opponents don't generally expect you to actually use the air-to-air missiles, so often you can simply take people off guard with them. Additionally, the rockets can often land hits on air-to-air targets because they are pretty easy to aim. My overall thoughts on the attack helicopters, though, in terms of how they perform in game, is that they are probably, in my humble experience, the most feast or famine vehicles you can possibly get in the entire game of Battlefield 6. If you have a really good pilot and you have a really good gunner, you can do a lot of damage to the enemy team and make your team's life considerably easier. However, if one or both of your crew members are not up to scratch, you could have some very serious issues. In particular, if your pilot is not very good, your likelihood of face planting into the ground is exceptionally high. If your gunner is not very good, then you're going to see a significant drop in efficiency because it turns out the main gun can basically be fired incredibly fast and is pretty effective, and if your gunner is just not very good with it, your main source of damage output is going to be a lot less effective than it could be. On top of that, the level of threat that attack helicopters face right now on most maps is basically all over the place. There is currently a bug with the IFV where you can use the target designator on the IFV to mark a target, then you can fire its lock-guided missiles at that target and it will basically hit a helicopter through flares. If memory serves, the devs did acknowledge this was a bug and this will get looked at some point. However, even if you ignore that, I was dying quite a bit to simply aim-guided missiles from things like tanks or IFVs, or even just the tows mounted around the map that people will just pick up and fire at a helicopter if you're being a general nuisance. On top of that, you will sometimes just get slammed out of the air by RPGs seemingly out of nowhere from people that just take pot shots at you with them. So these helicopters can sometimes run an entire map and sometimes just get destroyed without really doing much, and it's hard to really control which of those two factors you land on. On top of that, there is a bit of an oddity right now in that teammates cannot generally jump in the gunner seat. Only people in your squad can jump in the gunner gunner seat. So if you grab in the pilot seat, you either have to track down somebody else to be your gunner or hope one of your squad members spawns in, or you just don't have a gunner and you're going to lose a considerable amount of your DPS. In that respect, while the attack helicopters do feature a fairly considerable amount of power if they're left unchecked on the map, they're also one of the more annoying vehicles to use successfully without just randomly getting swatted out of the sky. Moving on to War Thunder, and one of the biggest differences you're going to notice is the War Thunder loadout system for equipping aircraft. These are all of the different weapons that you can theoretically equip on each of the 4 pylons for just the AH-64E. This is not including the HAD, although the HAD does have some similar options. Additionally, while the AH-64E does have a single type of ammunition that it basically always uses, the HAD has variable ammunition. You can select what ammo belt you're using for a given situation. So in general, there is a lot more customization in War Thunder in terms of how you arrange your loadouts. And given that the spawn costs in helicopters can vary pretty wildly based on how little or how much you take, it is actually worthwhile to build a few different custom loadouts for different situations, the different spawn costs you may have. Another major difference you're going to notice between War Thunder helicopters and Battlefield 6 helicopters is that War Thunder helicopters operate on a much larger battlefield. In War Thunder, while the ground battlefield can be anywhere from 1 kilometer to 1 kilometer up to 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers, the air battlefield around it is going to be essentially 20 to 24 kilometers in all directions. The attack helicopters have a closer spawn that's usually around 4 kilometers from the ground battlefield, and also a further away spawn that's around 6 to 8, it kind of depends on the map. What this means is that when you compare the relatively tiny airspace that you have in a Battlefield 6 map, especially maps like downtown Manhattan, where if the helicopter strays even a little bit away from the main ground map, it's basically out of bounds, the War Thunder helicopters have a lot more room to breathe and a lot more room to find annoying positions to pester the enemy team with. With that being said, one of the biggest fundamental differences you'll notice in playstyles between War Thunder attack helicopters and Battlefield 6 attack helicopters is that Battlefield 6 attack helicopters really like doing strafing runs with rocket pods, and in War Thunder, while you can do that and you can sometimes be successful, it's important to note that the anti-aircraft systems at this battle rating are insanely powerful. The IRIS-T has a notional range of around 40 kilometers, and most of the anti-aircraft systems can reach out and touch targets between the 8 to 10 range with basically no issues. This means that unlike a lot of Battlefield 6 maps where the helicopters will be flying in and around buildings and making a general pest of themselves at essentially point blank range, in War Thunder helicopters tend to be a lot more standoffish and use terrain to their advantage, things like buildings, hills, etc., hiding behind those, peeking out, firing some shots, and then peeking back. This is of course also where you get into some of the more advanced systems, measures, and countermeasures that are involved in aircraft play in War Thunder, and honestly if I were to go into all of those there would be an entirely separate video, but long story short, locking and firing a missile at somebody in War Thunder is a very involved process with a lot of different things going on in the background, and the types of evasive maneuvers you have to take heavily depends on the type of missile fired at you and from what vehicle it was fired from. With that being said, the AH-64E Apache is one of the more contentious aircraft right now because it has the new JAGM missiles, which were only released in the last update, and these missiles have a range of essentially, yes, basically any reasonable range that you can shoot these missiles at, they will be able to hit targets. Tentatively, they have a lock range of around 10 to 15 kilometers, but this basically means that if you can see it, you can probably hit it. It also has a thermal imaging system that has a pretty nice resolution, so it does allow you to see targets much more easily at longer ranges. And on top of that, unlike in Battlefield 6 where it takes a while to lock a target, War Thunder, like I said in the previous videos, you can actually just lock a target as soon as it sees a heat signature if you are using IR missiles. So it's very easy to rattle off salvos of missiles basically all at once. With that being said, if you do run out of missiles, you will have to return to the helipad to rearm. So the downtime in between salvos is actually higher than it will be in Battlefield 6, but not as much for helicopters just because helicopters can be closer to the battlefield in general. Helicopters in War Thunder also very prominently feature a mechanic called an auto tracker, which is essentially an aimbot. You lock on to an enemy target and it will direct all of your weapon systems that use that type of guidance to that target, and this includes your gun. Not only does it lock your gun onto the target, but it will also apply lead, so you can actually bullfight incoming jets pretty efficiently by locking onto them and moving off to the side as they're trying to line up a shot on you. Helicopters in War Thunder are just a fundamentally different animal from Battlefield 6 because they tend to behave more like they do in real life. That is to say, they are frail enough that if they expose themselves to too much enemy fire and get too close to anti-aircraft systems, they tend to go pop very easily, but they can also use terrain to hide and sit very long ranges and start popping targets, and if you don't have any kind of specific way to shoot back, such as an anti-aircraft system, you are often pretty helpless to really do anything about these helicopters that are just sitting back anywhere from 4 to 10 kilometers away from you, raining missiles down on your forehead. Indeed, especially when you start dealing with things like infrared missiles, you often don't get any warning that the missile is approaching at all. You just have to hope it doesn't kill you. There are some vehicles that have hard kill systems that can potentially defeat these missiles, but they are few and far between, and often the first warning that you will get that an AH-64E has taken a liking to your face is when you all of a sudden receive a missile and possibly get sent back to the hangar. It would be fair to say that helicopters in War Thunder have been a very contentious issue for a very long time. Unlike normal planes, helicopters lack their own game mode, so the only place you can really run helicopters in War Thunder is in ground battles, taking out other players, or potentially the Heli PvE mode, but the Heli PvE mode has very limited rewards, and if you play it a lot, it will get somewhat repetitive. On top of that, helicopters tend to be very binary in War Thunder. They're nowhere near as fast or maneuverable as a plane, so if you have something that counters them, they often simply die and don't really have a good chance to fight back. But if you don't have a way to counter them, they simply destroy you and you don't get a way to fight back. So in that respect, helicopters are one of the least liked elements of the game of War Thunder, simply because they often feel like they are completely uninteractive. In this section, I'm just going to give a bit of an honorable mention to the transport helicopter. It's obviously based on the UH-60, the Black Hawk, and it's only getting an honorable mention because there isn't much to compare. It doesn't have any options or really any weapons other than basic defensive miniguns. It has one pilot, it has 2 minigunners and 2 passengers that just sit out the doors, and mostly is just a transport vehicle. It doesn't have a great equivalent in War Thunder because while War Thunder has hinted that infantry might come at some point, currently doesn't have any infantry, so a dedicated transport helicopter that doesn't do anything else wouldn't serve much of a purpose. There are variants of the Black Hawk helicopter in game, but they are attack variants that can specifically mount things like Hellfire missiles, Spike missiles, etc., so they don't compare all that well to this particular helicopter. In Battlefield 6, the transport helicopter is basically just a mobile spawn point. It's a great way to give your teammates a lift to parts of the map that would otherwise be very inaccessible. It can do so more rapidly and often honestly more safely than a lot of the ground transport, and you can also use to get to the top of vantage points that would otherwise be very difficult or impossible to get to on foot. So overall, just a generally useful utility vehicle, but there's not really that much you can say about it. However, I did actually have the opportunity to pick a brain of a US Army pilot who had flown the UH-60, the AH-64, and even the AH-6 Little Bird. He had actually most recently trained on the Black Hawk, but because he had already trained on 2 previous helicopters, technically had more flight hours than his instructor. His overall thoughts on the aircraft were the biggest thing he mentioned as a positive about the Apache was that the Apache had air conditioning, which I thought was pretty funny. Additionally, on the Blackhawks, he actually mentioned they had a pretty good autopilot, so if you were flying long distances, they were pretty easy going. For the Little Bird, he mentioned that it was generally pretty fun to fly. However, it does lack in creature comforts in a lot of areas, so it is definitely more stressful on longer missions, at least in his opinion. Presumably the Little Bird is getting added to Battlefield 6 at some point, but who knows when that'll be. I just thought this was a fun little anecdote for anybody that's interested. And now we're moving on to the planes, the last category of aircraft, and we're going to cover all 4 of them at once, partially because the stealth jets don't really have any equivalent in War Thunder, and also partially because, honestly, there's not that much to these planes to cover. For the attack jets, you have the F-61V, which is obviously a variant of the F-16 Fighting Falcon, and then you also have the F-39E, which is also a variant of the JAS-39 Gripen. The F-97 Kestrel is pretty obviously supposed to be the F-22 Raptor, and the Su-57 is, well, the Su-57. Now, you might ask what specific variant each of these planes is of their respective family, except it doesn't really matter that much. As we're about to see, there are very few upgrades, there are very restrictive weapons, and all of them tend to kind of sort of play the same to the point where it's not really that relevant which variant it's supposed to be, because you wouldn't really notice any difference between the variants anyway with how simplified they basically are. This also brings us to the first minor issue with these aircraft, in that all of them have essentially the same gun, and that gun is listed as a 30mm Gatling cannon, and No, it isn't. None of these aircraft have 30mm Gatling cannons. 30mm Gatling cannons is essentially what you'd have on the A-10 Warthog. It would be an incredibly powerful gun for any of these vehicles to have. None of these vehicles have it. The two American planes, the F-16 and the F-22, both have the 20mm Vulcan Gatling cannon, so it is similar at least in rate of fire, although it is noticeably lower caliber. The JAS-39 actually has a 27mm Mauser cannon, which fires considerably slower than a Gatling cannon. The Su-57 likewise has a 30mm cannon that also fires significantly slower than a Gatling cannon. So while the two American planes effectively should be using the same gun, the other two planes having the same gun is not really accurate in any conceivable way. They are essentially completely wrong. This also brings up a somewhat odd point in that for some reason we have the Su-57, which is the only Russian vehicle in this entire game, and it's only listed as the fighter jet. It's not listed as the stealth jet like it was in some previous games, so I'm not sure why this couldn't have been something like a Rafale or a Eurofighter, which would have been more in theme with the rest of Pax Armada's kit, because Pax Armada is a lot more European than it is Russian, but it's whatever. The two fighter jets are exceedingly basic. While they do have up to 4 bombs they can carry, and the bombs visually look like 2,000 pounders, although are considerably less powerful than a 2,000 pounder, that's really all they have. They don't have any air-to-air missiles at all. All they have is a basic cannon and the 4 bombs, and that's really it. The only other unique feature they have over the attack jets is that you can use the afterburners to do thrust vectoring, where you basically flip your plane around, which is a cool trick in a dogfight, but generally speaking doesn't make them play that much differently in most instances. The attack jets likewise have a very anemic loadout. They only have 2 of the basic bombs. As far as I can tell, they are unguided bombs, and again visually look like 2,000 pounders, even though their effect on target is noticeably lower. They also have anti-tank missiles that are referred to as the AGM-75, which are obviously supposed to be the AGM-65 Maverick missiles. They behave basically like every other lock-guided missile in the game. You keep your crosshair pointed at the enemy for a certain period of time, you lock them, and then you fire, and that's really about it. Currently, in the game of Battlefield 6, there are no options whatsoever to upgrade any part of these 4 aircraft. What you see is what you get. You cannot upgrade systems, you cannot upgrade upgrades, you cannot upgrade your munitions, you cannot upgrade your guns. What this effectively means is that the major difference that you're going to see between the attack jets and the fighter jets is that the fighter jets can perform the Cobra maneuvers essentially by using the thrust vectoring, and the attack jets have access to the anti-tank missiles, and that's really it. Both of them have the same guns, both of them have the same bombs. This is also where it's probably worth mentioning that all of the jets in Battlefield 6 are almost comically slow. We're talking a World War II turboprop levels of slow, and this is partially because the actual airspace around the battlefield is pretty small, to the point where if these jets could actually go supersonic like they're supposed to in real life, you would basically run out of space almost instantly. For anybody that's aware, the F-22 does have super cruise that it can do at certain altitudes, where it essentially cruises supersonic without using its afterburners, which obviously you couldn't have a jet going anywhere near that fast in Battlefield 6. You would basically always be running out of the skybox. This is obviously part of the reason why the surface-to-air lock ranges are generally only 300 meters unless somebody has designated an aircraft. Because obviously if you could lock these aircraft out to the 4 to 6 kilometers that you would probably be able to with a Stinger in real life, then you would basically be able to lock them regardless of where they were on the map, as long as you had line of sight to them. Additionally, and this is a bit of a weird one, the lock for the surface-to-air and air-to-air missiles doesn't count vertical distance, so you can actually be a kilometer above a Gepard and the Gepard will still lock you for some reason. It's a very odd mechanic. Overall, with the attack jets, while I found the helicopters to be very feast and famine, you could have really good games and then you could just kind of get shot down instantly, it was very easy for the jets, both attack and fighter variants, to survive against basically anything that's not another jet. However, their impact on the ground and in terms of their ability to affect the battlefield and how the battle was going for your teammates was actually pretty low. I felt these aircraft were not super impactful in most instances. Certainly, you would rarely get those cases of the really good pilots that could just drop their dumb bombs exactly where they wanted to and would really disrupt you on certain capture points, but that was really about it. And this also brings up one of the bigger issues with both types of aircraft, but especially the planes, because of how fast they move. Obviously they don't move that fast, but they do move fast enough to where identifying small targets on the ground is incredibly difficult. So trying to find pockets or concentrations of infantry to drop a bomb can actually be a challenge unto itself. Additionally, trying to find armor armored vehicles to hit unless they're marked or spotted by your team can also be a bit of a challenge. This is where recon is essentially basically vital to your jets really contributing or doing anything to the game, because if recon is not spotting those infantry and not spotting those ground vehicles, you're basically going to just have to spot targets manually or just kind of guess where the enemy might be, and that is not a great path to success. Certainly with the fighter jets, clearing things like attack helicopters and other attackers out of the sky can give you some pretty good value, but for the attackers in general, if you are taking an attack jet up, you probably want to hit ground targets, but if you can't reliably see or figure out where the enemy is, it's going to be a bit of a chore. So on the whole, I found all of the jets were pretty mid, and most of the time, both when I was flying them and when other people were flying them against me, they really struggled to do all that much that you would really care about on the battlefield. Certainly dying to this plane that it's really hard to shoot back at is annoying, but most of the time they're only getting a handful of kills each time they take a plane up, and all of this is just compounded by the fact that often when a plane sees another plane, they try to dogfight each other, and now you're wasting even more time not doing anything on the ground. In reality, while the planes are good background music that makes the game feel more cinematic, they often don't really do that much. In War Thunder, obviously the big difference you will notice between the War Thunder jets and their Battlefield 6 counterparts, and something I've already alluded to, is that in War Thunder, planes generally go their historical speeds, and the airspace around the battlefield is dramatically bigger just to compensate for the fact these planes can go incredibly fast and can dogfight each other. The vertical and horizontal area you have to work with when you're in a jet in War Thunder is actually incredibly large. In fact, you start when you spawn in one of these top tier aircraft around 24 kilometers away from the ground battlefield, so you have a bit of a flight to get there just in order to get to the opportunity to employ your weapon systems. On top of that, War Thunder's flight physics are considerably more refined than they are in the game of Battlefield. Things like stall speeds are much better represented, and in general the overall flight performance of the aircraft is wildly different. Unlike in Battlefield 6, where all the aircraft kind of handle the same, in War Thunder all of the aircraft handle a little bit differently. Even variants of the same plane, such as the F-16, some variants are heavier, some are lighter, some have better tail sections that give them more lift, etc, etc. There are a bunch of small factors that can contribute, and of course the type of loadout you take and how heavy and how much drag the different weapon systems you choose to take out can also have an impact on how well you can fight another plane. Speaking of, much like the attack helicopters, here's just the basic list of all of the ordnance on the F-16. I'm not even going to begin to go over all of this because we have basically any and everything. We have long-range air-to-air missiles, we have short-range air-to-air missiles, we have optically guided missiles, we have laser guided bombs, we have GPS guided bombs, we have dumb bombs, we have dumb rockets, you name it, it is on this airframe. We also have things like targeting pods with high quality thermals that you can use to target these munitions from very long distances, etc, etc. The lock range of the infrared guided Mavericks is around 10 kilometers plus or minus, depends on the type of target, the terrain, etc, etc. There are a lot of different factors, but the lock range has to be around 10 kilometers because a lot of the anti-aircraft systems can reach out and touch you from even further away. Additionally, in War Thunder, a lot of the newer anti-aircraft systems are actually pretty good at intercepting incoming missiles as well. Something like an IRIS-T system has 16 missiles ready to fire, so if you fire a salvo of 6 Mavericks, it could theoretically intercept all 6. This also brings up the really disappointing part about Battlefield 6 compared to War Thunder, is that in War Thunder you can have these really flexible multi-role loadouts like you see on this F-16, where we have 6 AGM-65 Mavericks for ground targets, we also have 2 AMRAAMs for air targets, and another 2 Sidewinders as basically backups for air targets. So you have a nice combination of being able to perform both the air-to-ground and air-to-air role on one loadout. Whereas in Battlefield 6 you don't really have any options, and there currently are no air-to-air options whatsoever, which is kind of disappointing. In War Thunder, it also needs to be noted that the air-to-air and air-to-ground and ground-to-air threats are all pretty ridiculous in terms of the amount of factors that have to be considered. The type of missile, whether it be radar-guided semi-active radar homing, active radar homing, or whether it's an infrared, and if it's an infrared, is it an all-aspect infrared, does it have IRCCMs? These all dictate exactly what you have to do in order to defeat an incoming missile, and techniques for dodging different missiles can get pretty varied. Some missiles you have to notch, some you have to multipass, some you have to chaff, some you have to flare, some you have to go cold on your engines, etc, etc. There's a whole bunch of different techniques that varies pretty heavily based on the specific enemy that you're actually fighting. So in War War Thunder, the missile versus anti-missile threat is actually pretty significant. That being said, most planes at top tier have a very large inventory of countermeasures as well, so instead of having countermeasures on cooldown, you have a set amount of countermeasures that you can use before you have to go back and reload. Which also brings us neatly to another fun part of War Thunder, in that in War Thunder you don't automatically reload your weapon systems on jets, much like on helicopters. So if you run dry on missiles, air-to-air, air-to-ground, you run dry on bombs, you run dry on guns or chaff or flares, you're going to have to fly all the way back to the airfield, which is usually around 20 kilometers away from the battlefield. You're going to have to successfully land your plane without exploding, which also is a trick a lot of players haven't really mastered, and then you have to take off and fly back to the ground battlefield. So the round trip to refresh your munitions in War Thunder is very high. This also neatly segues into the topic of the various cannons on different top tier aircraft, not just these aircraft specifically, but also basically all of them, in that top tier aircraft, the cannon is not really the primary weapon, it's a backup to a backup essentially. So in general, it's not expected that you'll be using that much, so most cannons only have about 10 to 15 seconds of firing time. So you're probably not using it for strafe ground targets all that much. Indeed, in most instances, the primary use for a cannon will simply be to take out a helicopter, because helicopters tend to be some of the hardest aircraft to lock with radar or infrared guided missiles, because they're usually pretty low to the ground and usually have very small heat signatures. And all of this is really only scratching the surface on how much these aircraft differ in War Thunder than they do in Battlefield 6, because honestly these are just so fundamentally different that it's hard to reasonably compare them. In Battlefield 6 they're so oversimplified in terms of the amount of weapon systems, their flight performance, etc., that they're very much fake planes. They're things that look like planes but that aren't actually planes. So trying to even begin side-by-siding them with the aircraft in War Thunder is just not really all that effective. They are almost completely different animals. With that being said, if you want some really unproductive conversation, feel free to ask your average War Thunder player what they think about top tier CAS. I'm sure they will have some really awesome opinions for you on that subject. While helicopters have been pretty consistently hated by the player base, planes go a little bit more back and forth, because depending on how strong the anti-aircraft systems are, the planes haven't always been as threatening as the helicopters. It kind of just varies from meta to meta. In general right now though, most players do absolutely hate these planes with a passion. As I mentioned with the ranges, the Maverick, which is not even the most powerful infrared missile you can fire, has a lock range of around 8 to 10 kilometers, and if you're a tank on the ground battlefield, the plane that fired that Maverick at you is just a speck on the horizon, so it often feels like there's very little you can do about these missiles. For this reason, the War Thunder top tier close air support gets a very considerable amount of hate, and I can't say it's completely undeserved. With that being said, at least the planes, once they fire their salvo, do have to go back to base to rearm and can't simply harass you the entire game in the same way a helicopter can. So at this point we've covered basically all the vehicles in Battlefield 6 that it makes sense to cover, so I'm going to give you some closing thoughts and tips on how to play the vehicles, and also some thoughts on Battlefield 6 in general before we wrap things up. And also, as an aside, Imagine Sharky did helpfully ask if we could see some rapid infantry gameplay, and sure, that's going to be playing in the background so you can see exactly how I play a normal game of Battlefield 6. That being said, I am definitely past my prime as a first-person shooter gamer, so don't expect to see a lot of 360 no-scopes, but I can usually hit my shots. The first tip, and this is going to be a big one for anybody that flies helicopters but doesn't want to spend a ton of time trying to learn how to actually fly them well, is make sure you turn on auto hover. Helicopters have an auto hover feature where they will attempt to keep the helicopter centered in three-dimensional space if you don't provide any input. So if you don't touch the controls, it will just stay where it's currently at in the air, vertically and horizontally. In my humble opinion, DICE should actually enable this feature by default, because the players that actually need it probably won't know it's there, and the players that don't need it can just turn it off, because those are the kind of players that are going to look in these settings and dig in with all of their controls anyway. The second tip, and probably one that most War Thunder players don't need but that I've seen a lot of Battlefield players screw this up on, is you need to be aware of where your hull and turret are facing at all times. War Thunder players are probably very familiar with this because you know you always want to show the front armor to your enemy, but somebody who just plays Battlefield and doesn't understand how bad it can be to back your main battle tank into a situation can suddenly experience their main battle tanks just suddenly exploding for no reason. And this also extends to taking corners. You want to take a corner in such a way so that you're showing the enemy as much of your front armor as possible. Additionally, kind of on the same vein as that general tip, it's also important to realize that because it takes so much longer for a ground vehicle rather than an infantryman to reorient its hull, you always want to keep yourself in a position where in order to get out of a fight, all you have to do is back up. This obviously requires a little bit of forethought and planning on your part when you're driving the vehicle around, especially if you're driving in really confined spaces like a city, but it is definitely worth it because it allows you to quickly escape a bad situation. The other tip is that while these vehicles can be pretty well armored, they are definitely not invincible, and in general, providing fire support for your team, and especially with the IFVs, providing fire support near a capture point along with that mobile spawn point can be very invaluable, and you also provide the enemy something to distract them with and shoot at. Additionally, as long as you're staying back a little enough to provide fire support, you don't necessarily have to rush onto the point yourself. This is another big mistake I see people making where they just YOLO a vehicle into the middle of the enemy team, and that's not exactly how you're supposed to use these vehicles. They're supposed to be mobile bases of fire for your team that can provide support, and then once your team pushes up, you essentially leapfrog and provide support from a new position. This is especially important for ground vehicles given how many mines there are in the game right now, because as I said previously, every engineer starts with 3 mines, so engineers will just mine the most random areas, and if your infantry, especially your engineers, can go ahead of you and start doing route clearance while they're clearing rooms, that makes your life a lot easier. Additionally, this also brings up another point. If you're trying to escape a bad situation, don't go to a place that you haven't already gone. Don't try to drive forward out of that bad situation because the likelihood that you'll hit a mine is very high. This is a big mistake I've seen a lot of players make, is they start taking fire and they start panicking, so instead of taking a route they know is safe and they know is not mined, they will try to take some kind of stupid side street and just instantly blow up. This is also where it's important to understand that if you are an engineer that is supporting a tank, there are 2 useful things you can do. The number 1 thing is to help it stay alive by repairing it or clearing mines. The number 2 thing you can do is help it stay alive by killing enemies that are trying to shoot your tank with missiles, or alternatively help it out by shooting RPGs at enemy armored vehicles to reduce the amount of shots your tank needs to destroy it. Engineer is both about helping your tanks to survive, but another key component of helping your tanks to survive is helping the enemy to not survive by unaliving them. For me personally, this is the biggest pet peeve. If you have 3 engineers just sitting behind your vehicle repairing it, one of those engineers could be clearing mines, could be clearing out individuals with RPGs, could be throwing RPGs at enemy tanks, etc., and that would probably do a lot more than 3 people trying to fix 1 vehicle. It's going along with the old thing that I always say when I give advice for War Thunder, is you usually want to be looking at directions or doing things that your team isn't already doing, because that's going to provide you a much more impact. Having 2 people or 3 people or 4 people shooting down the same lane is not as useful as having individual people cover individual lanes. In terms of aircraft, and this is also something that I suspect a lot of War Thunder players will already have at least some experience with, you always want to plot both your entrance and your exit. Obviously, you need to have an entrance that will give you a good line of sight and a good attack vector on your targets, but if you don't have a good exit vector to leave, you could just end up smashing into a mountain or running head first into a bunch of the enemy air defenses and just getting shot down. You always want to have both the entrance plan and the exit plan if you plan to dive in with either a helicopter or a jet. As for the game of Battlefield 6, in my opinion, it just feels like a Battlefield game. It feels like some of the classic Battlefield experience you would expect in BF3 and BF4. And for a lot of people that are saying, well, BF3 and BF4 were way better, I feel like there's a lot of nostalgia goggles in play, because it turns out BF3 and BF4 were very buggy when they first launched. In fact, BF4 was borderline unplayable when it launched, to the point where they actually got sued by their investors saying they lied to them. So it's important to remember that the launches for Battlefield games have been historically very rocky and very buggy. However, a lot of that does get ironed out later, and BF3 and BF4 are currently remembered as pretty much classics of the franchise and some of the golden era of Battlefield. So I always like to keep in mind that a lot of the best games, at least in terms of the players for the franchise, have been games that, at least at launch, were in a suboptimal state. And Battlefield 6 certainly isn't without its issues, but for me personally, the vibes are absolutely on point. The game game generally looks good and honestly just has a very classic early 2000s Battlefield vibe to it, obviously with updated graphics and gameplay. Of course, that's just my opinion on the matter. You can have whatever opinion you like, that's just how I personally view it. If anybody cares, my favorite class to run is the Engineer with the M4A1 carbine. If anybody's wondering why I use iron sights on the M4A1, it's because that's what I was issued when I was in the military, so I just like using the iron sights. That's just my personal preference. And that fully wraps us up for this comparison series on Battlefield 6 versus War Thunder. I hope you guys enjoyed it, hope you learned something. If you did, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.